Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to the second workshop of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity with the financial sector on the key issue of the alignment of financial flows with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I am Odile Conchou, Financial Sector and TNFD focal point at the Secretariat, and I will be your Master of Ceremony today. This event has been organized in partnership with representatives of some organizations that I would like to thank first. So representative from UNEP-FI, the Finance Initiative of the United Nations Environment Programme, from UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, from the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation and Finance for Biodiversity Initiative, from Cornell University, the French Agency of Development Bank, the World Bank, the Dutch and Swiss Ministries of Environment, and the Nature Conservancy. I thank all of them. Before giving the floor to the two prestigious speakers who will introduce the workshop and its topic, let me give you some housekeeping information. This event is recorded, and the recording will be available on YouTube and on the workshop webpage on the CBD site. All participants' microphone and camera are muted, and we will have a Q&A, a question and answer session after both panels. So if you want, you can write your questions in advance in the chat box, and if possible, specify to whom they are addressed, and the panelists will answer them during the Q&A session. And for the panelists, I thank you, in order to avoid any interfering noise, to kindly mute your microphone when you are not speaking. So it's now my pleasure to invite Mrs. Elisabeth Maruma Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, to introduce the workshop. Elisabeth, you have the floor.
Sincere thanks, Odile, for the introduction. But let me first also thank all the participants, particularly the panelists, and Inga Anderson, our Executive Director, for being able to join us for this event. Greetings to you all, depending on where we are located. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this second workshop on the important topic of aligning financial flows with our post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As mentioned during our first part of the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Climate COP26 in Glasgow, the role of the public and private financial sector beyond government, business, civil society is fundamental to address the global climate and biodiversity crises. In June this year, we held the first workshop with the financial sector, which explored how the financial sector can most effectively contribute to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and its implementation. Several proposals for the framework were made, such as alignment of the financial flows with biodiversity objectives, and identified possible priority actions by parties and financial institutions. The alignment of financial flows with climate goals was included as one of the 3 goals set out by the Paris Agreement at Climate Change COP21 in Paris. Achieving support from the financial sector in the lead-up to the Paris Agreement was key, as was the agreement's clear mandate for the financial sector's sector to play a role in the climate discussions. Alignment of financial flows with global biodiversity goals is going to be equally important to the success of our 15th Conference of the Parties, and also for the effective implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In this regard, this follow-up workshop will provide more information specifically on the concept of aligning financial flows with the objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework and how that can be operationalized by presenting concrete projects supported by public and private financial institutions and a framework to help this sector assess and disclose nature-related risks and opportunities. It will link these actions to the needs of the parties in mobilizing resources from all sources, including through biodiversity finance plans. It will also clarify the role of the regulatory and policy framework to provide enabling environment for the private financial sector to align its financial flows. And it will equally support the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that can be translated into concrete and practical actions by the global financial sector. I therefore look forward to our discussion this morning from my side. Thank you very much, Odile. Back to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your opening and your warm welcome. You have set us ambitious objectives. It's now a great honor to invite Mrs. Inge Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, to deliver her opening remarks. Mrs. Anderson, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Odile, and it's a great pleasure to be here together with Elizabeth and some very dear colleagues who are leaning in on this critical agenda. I think it's fair to say that we're here for one reason, one simple reason. We're not putting enough money into conservation and into the sustainable use of biodiversity, and failing to do that is endangering the very success of the Global Biodiversity Framework that is under negotiation as we speak. Now, some estimates say that we have this funding gap of $600 to $800 billion per year for biodiversity by 2030. And UNEP's State of the Finance for Nature report identifies 4.1 trillion financing gap by 2050. So continuing as we are is not a very sound policy for the future and for the sustainability of planet Earth. And so that's quite pessimistic when we consider the state of play today. Investments in nature-based solutions, for example, amounted to around 130 billion today. But these investments need to triple by 2030 and increase fourfold by 2050 from the current level to retain resilience, to retain productivity, and to retain the services that these ecosystems today produce. So how do we get there? Yeah, governments need to do more. And the governments particularly need to set policy reforms, such as redirecting harmful subsidies, agricultural, fisheries, etc., also on agricultural chemicals, away from destruction and undermining nature towards securing that our food remains affordable and yet produced in a nature positive way. And we need to see efforts to reduce risks to the public and to private investors. So how are we going to make that happen? The public sector can't do it all, and we just heard Elizabeth speak about aligning the financial flows. We understand that today, when we look at where are the investments coming from, well, it's around 86% into nature-based solutions that are actually coming from public resources. So that's good on public, thank you. But we need to think broader, right? It's too low, it's too little, and it's not going to do the lift that we understand we need. So the private sector is being invited in, but what is it that will take them come in? Because it's obviously seeking, it's reducing the risk, it's understanding where the profitability lies. And that's a conversation that we haven't quite had, because up until now, that's an externality that is not taken account for as we deplete, pave over, destroy, cut down, emit. We haven't quite understood that that has long-term consequences. So the new nature economy, as we understand it, could potentially generate these $10 trillion in business value and 400 million jobs, etc., by 2030, if we get it right. So negotiators to the Global Biodiversity Framework can help in this regard. Now, that means that it's not just an environmental dimension, it is a finance dimension, and that's why we are having this. There is a goal on finance in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but financiers are not going to look at this goal. They will look at the enabling environment that to a large extent is created by the public sector governance and regulatory elements. And so we need to find a way of closing this gap that I've highlighted. Now, we've learned a lot from the climate story, and I'm sure today we will have some good conversation around this, because we've understood how we can make that alignment happen, shifting finance over into, yes, profitable for the investor, but also for the long-term sustainability of planet Earth. The Paris Agreement had these three objectives, right? Mitigation, adaptation, and finance. Article 21C, if I recall correctly, on alignment of financial flows, set the stage for how private sector actors could converge and mobilize. And under the recently launched Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, we've seen 450 financial institutions announce their commitments. Now, one thing is announcing, another thing is delivering, but it's a process that represents about $130 trillion in private capital. So these alliances with banks, with insurers, with investors are convened by UNEP and the UN under UNEP FI. And that has been a long journey, nearly 30 years of building this up. But now we see really that there is a commitment by the private sector to make these shifts. Do I think it's late? Yes. Is it too late? I hope not. Do we need to put emphasis on it? Absolutely, so that we stay and ensure that 1.5 is kept alive. But this is something we need to learn from in the biodiversity setting. What does that look like for nature and biodiversity? I hope we will explore that in this session. Where do we find the returns for the investor? How will the financial flows actually align? What are the shifts that the regulatory settings need to put in place, both inside central banks, but also at the broader industry and sectoral level? Let me just mention one sector that is obvious, and that's action in the food system sector. That will be really critical. We know that food systems drive biodiversity loss, both in terms of how we produce, but also how we consume and waste. If we shift financial incentives in favor of nature-positive consumption, and earlier today I spoke at the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy Review in the EU, precisely on this issue, shifting in terms of nature-positive production and consumption, we can achieve a significant amount under the Global Biodiversity Framework. If we eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies, which have been under negotiation by the WTO for quite some time, we can get further onto a healthy and safe marine environment. If we deal with effluents into the oceans, plastic and toxicity and nutrients and nitrogen, we can get healthy oceans. And the financial sector can accelerate the deployment of capital into emerging markets and developing countries. That today we are seeing deforestation from expansion on agriculture, but we can have deforestation-free products. Financial sector can remove deforestation from their portfolio. And these kind of opportunities include making concessional finance available, yes, to accelerate that transition to the nature positive, which is sort of the net zero, if you like, for sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And here UNEP is supporting the Good Food Finance Network, which is seeking to accelerate this transformation. So I'm really hoping that this workshop will further explain how this alignment can happen, what needs to be done. And I hope you will take this new knowledge into the world and really begin to unlock that finance that we know we need to make the new Global Biodiversity Framework a success, to protect biodiversity, because we all understand that that's absolutely critical to our future and our health. So thank you very much. Handing it back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Anderson, for your opening statement and for highlighting the need for the public and private financial sector to align their flows with the objective of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and for the framework to include strong language calling for this alignment, reminding us of the importance of such a goal in the Climate Paris Agreement. So much is said about it. We speak and hear a lot about this alignment issue, but in the end, as Mrs. Anderson said, what does it mean to align financial flows with biodiversity objectives and with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? To answer this question, I am very pleased to open the first panel with excellent panelists. This panel will be moderated by Mr. Simon Zadek, and I thank you, Simon, and all the panelists to open your mic and camera. Simon is the chair of the Finance for Biodiversity Initiative and director of Migrant Nations. He is also senior advisor to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the TNFD. So Simon, I let you introduce your panel. The floor is yours until 2:55 p.m. in Europe. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Odile. And in many ways, Elizabeth and Inge have set out, I think, very clearly our broader context and also the challenges and opportunities in advancing the way in which CBD helps to shepherd, if you like, global finance into a constructive and positive alignment with the kind of nature goals that CBD and all of us want to ensure are set and achieved. I'm just going to make one or two observations and then really turn straight over to our really excellent panel. And the observation, I guess, builds perhaps a little bit on Inge's points about the way in which this has progressed in the context of the climate negotiations, and really to say, at one level, nature, should we say, as a process, sits somewhat behind the climate process, but actually over the past 2.5 years, there has been an extraordinary and positive surge in the way in which nature has catapulted, if you like, into the mainstream thinking about what we would broadly discuss as alignment of global finance with one or other sustainability goal. There's already been mention of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, definitely a mouthful, but in short, a way and a process of building nature as a risk and opportunity, analyzing dependencies and impacts into financial decision-making across global financial and capital markets. Inge also mentioned central banks, and we have the Network for Central Banks on Greening the Financial System, now a collection of 90 central banks and financial regulators beginning to shift their gaze and attention from a fairly exclusive focus on climate and indeed on carbon emissions, and now beginning to look at the broader agenda of biodiversity as a financial stability issue, so as an issue that concerns those that govern the financial system. And we see a wide range of innovations beginning to emerge across the financial system in sovereign debt markets, certainly in bank lending. We see digitalization, fintech playing an important role in helping to crowd in nature, not simply as a risk, but as Inge says, also as an opportunity. The food sector, obviously a critical piece of the story. In some ways, the sort of analogy of energy and mobility to climate is in some ways food to nature. Obviously not a perfect fit, but one way of perhaps helpfully thinking about it. So I think we're at a moment where nature perhaps is technically behind, but I would argue is catching up very quickly. And I think the opportunity of CBD to really catapult it yet more quickly into mainstream considerations in financial decision making is an opportunity that should not be missed. So with that, I'm going to turn to our really exceptional panel and try and draw from them not only insights into what is going on, but perhaps guidance from them as to where we might go in operationalizing this idea of alignment in the context of the CBD text and framework and execution modalities. I'm going to start with Sylvie Lemay, if I may, the French ambassador on nature, a party obviously to CBD. Sylvie, I think you're there, although I can't actually see your picture popping up. But I'm hoping you might address the question of how not only yourself and the way you see it, but France, both domestically and internationally, is already advancing this agenda as we speak.
Good morning, everyone, and I hope you can hear me at least. There must be an issue with my webcam, which doesn't seem to pop up, and therefore I'm sorry that I'm not able to be seen, but I'm definitely with you. If you allow me, I would like to perhaps share with you what has happened in terms of climate issues and how indeed climate has been mainstreamed into the finance as of now. And one important issue that I would like to mention is that the first question was, how do we, in a way, access qualitative, comparable, and available data? And the same is going to be for biodiversity. If we would like the business as well as the public sector, by the way, I don't see any difference in terms of alignment. If we want to see all the investments and the expenditures of public and private to become biodiversity positive, if you wish, or at least neutral, it has to happen the same way, in my view. It is starting to happen for real in the climate area. And therefore, the first thing is, so how do we assess the impact that are currently being the impact of the different investments? I must say it started in 2015 with the task force on climate-related finance disclosure, and it was a private endeavor with investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters that looked at the risk mostly and the materiality risks. And this task force came up with several recommendations regarding the way to disclose information. And they recommended disclosures on 4 issues that are still relevant, I think, for biodiversity as well. One has to do with the governance of, for instance, the private institution and which kind of governance they would put in place to look at climate-related areas. The second one has to do with strategy, disclosing how climate is indeed incorporated in the strategy. The third one has to do with risk management, and the fourth one has to do with metrics and targets. That was one, if you wish, kind of the first endeavor to try to see what should we report on and what should we ask the private sector to report on. At the same time, in France, we put together a legislative framework asking the financial institution in a way to report on their climate impact. And that was really a first, and this started in 2015. Further, at the EU level, basically this legislation was kind of taken on board, and the European Commission set up a technical expert group on sustainable finance that came up with a legislative proposal in 2018. And there were basically 4 elements in this legislative proposal that I think are worth considering for and that will be useful for biodiversity. The first one is a classification system. It's a taxonomy, as we say. It's a terrible word, I feel, but anyway. Which is to say, how do we assess how green and how climate-friendly activities are? And perhaps I will spend a little time on that. Taxonomy.
Sylvia, just in the first round, if you can restrict to a couple more minutes, that would be great, and we can come back a little bit more detail.
Then I will then stop there and say, just in a few seconds, I feel that there is a need to have several tools to get to a clear mainstreaming and therefore shifting of financial flows. It's not just one, but it has to be systematic, and you have to start with assessing and what kind of data exists and making sure you have them. I will stop here, sorry.
Sylvie, thanks very much. And I apologize for interrupting. I'm sure if you'd had just that little bit more time, you would have talked about Article 29 in France, where you've built on that climate disclosure leadership and you're beginning to play it out for a second time in the nature space. And I think that's
exactly it. Yeah.
Let me then, Rachel, move on to you, if I may. You know, Dean at Tufts, but also just sort of person extraordinaire across many areas that we're dealing with today. And I'm quite keen to build on this, if you like, comparison with the climate space, in a way, getting away from the language and asking you, what real difference does it make if an international agreement such as in the climate or the nature space talks about alignment? How does that really play through to the market?
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and it's really lovely to be here, and anything to support the extraordinary leadership of Elizabeth and all of those trying to move forward. And I think there's a beauty to coming second, as it were. So there's lots to be learned from not only what was negotiated in Paris under the French leadership, but also then how things have emerged, and then what happened in Glasgow. So first of all, the language of 2.1c is vague, which is not a bad thing, right? So we have this constructive ambiguity, and I think that's. I think what was important that perhaps in the minds of people back in 2015 was sort of like a very sort of project by project question of financial flows, and what we've seen since 2015 is really this systemic financial systems approach, right? That the entire financial system is recalibrating around the risk associated with holding carbon assets. And I'm not sure to what extent any negotiators really understood that in 2015. So we've had these parallel tracks of, you know, public financial flows, you know, governed in the negotiations of finance in a climate talk. And, you know, frankly, while everybody, and I would agree with Inga and with Elizabeth that we need the governments to do what the governments need to do, they've singularly failed to be very creative within the context of negotiations in terms of public financial flows and alignment for Paris and for climate. And that's not just the lack of 100 billion, which is a sort of totemic political figure. It's also what I consider to be a little stodginess even in the way that development financial institutions and multilateral development banks have really embraced the need for a complete sort of systems overhaul. But then you've seen this huge move of private finance, and I think that's been driven by two things. One is by the understanding of macroprudential risk, and so trace that all the way back to Francois Hollande writing to the FSB creating the TCFD, which and then of course now we have the TNFD, but that has been very important. The leadership of a very small group of central banks, you referred to it, Simon, now over 90, and then important analytical work within the IMF, important analytical work within the European Central Bank and the Bank of England. And, you know, we had a hero for a number of years. We had Mark Carney going out and saying things that nobody else was saying. And I don't think we quite have the same figure on the biodiversity side. Maybe we don't need one. Maybe we just need lots of people talking truth to power. So all of those things happened, and I think that has started to become truly internalized, absent regulation. Now the beginning of regulation is starting to come over the horizon, but we don't regulate this stuff. It's still voluntary. And what I think Glasgow did do is shorten the glide path between voluntary to mandatory, and actually spur the fact that we are going to need regulation in order to be able to take care of a just transition. And my final point, Simon, is that if there has been this understanding of macroprudential risk, the other thing that has made it possible to move at this speed is a sort of certainty about the point on the horizon. So while we can drive a truck through many net zero claims, net zero has taken the public imagination, it's taken the imagination of financial institutions, And so cutting emissions by 45% by 2030, net zero by 2050, what does that mean? That leads to understanding within the boardroom, within the C-suite of how many of my assets do I need to get out of carbon? How many of my assets need to find green, positive assets to invest in? And you're seeing an extraordinary pressure now on where are those assets? What can I invest in? How can I invest in it? And you see that in individual portfolios and new products and services. You see it in the discussion around voluntary use of carbon markets, also the pressure on regulation of carbon markets. So you're starting to see what I would say a demand side pressure now, which we've never had before. Now, that's a huge opportunity for the CBD. And it's not about the 2.1C language. It's about how do you provide a sort of glide path for that finance to flow into what you need it to flow into.
Rachel, thank you. And similarly to Sylvie, we could dive deeply into that, but I would draw out one piece, if you like, before moving on to Erik Jan, which is you're kind of describing two different bodies of rules in a way, the stuff that's on the table at CBD, and then this huge body of rules and governing institutions and infrastructure around financial markets. And what we've somehow managed to figure out a bit in the climate space is how to connect these two bodies of rules in an effective way, either in the market or literally. And we sort of need to do the same thing with nature. Maybe that's something we can come back to in a second, because it sort of slightly blows the mind to sort of think about how one really does that in practice. Erik Jan, let me come to you. Thank you very much for coming on to this panel. As with everybody, you're obviously in the market, running a major financial institution, kind of feeling, if I might put it, sort of the pain and hopefully the upside of some of these developments. And it would be great, Erik Jan, to hear a little bit from you about how, again, starting with climate, kind of how that infrastructure on the climate deal side actually affects the way you make financial decision making. And if you have kind of a moment to spare, perhaps share a little bit of the pain, not only the upside enjoyment of making it all work in practice.
Well, thank you, Simon, for that introduction. And I really want to, I'll definitely reflect on your specific question on pain points on the climate journey, but to build really also on what Rachel sort of said here. You know, I am, as you say, representing the private financial sector today, and I can say that there is a strong and growing momentum for, you know, financial institutions that are committed to protecting and restore biodiversity. And I don't want to sort of spend much time on it, but still, the 84 of the largest financial institutions worldwide, with over 12 trillion euros in assets, have signed the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. In September, 78 institutions with 10 trillion assets signed the statement that they explicitly want an ambitious global biodiversity framework. So I think among the financial institutions, and us being one of them, there is this ambition. However, we need help in order to be able to both create the demand side and have the, if you like, the framework that will create the pipes for channeling this capital into the right opportunities. And that's, you know, two key messages I really wanted to share with you. One, you know, in the work, CBD's work, it's very important not only to look at public sector finance. You know, the private financial sector is needed and will be critical if we are to deliver on those actions. And I think that is what was recognized when in the climate, you know, mobilization on climate change. And I think, as Rachel said, to create that, well, simple narrative on a very complex issue, climate being complex, nature being even more complex, is a challenge. But something like, you know, a net zero of nature, or something that could be, you know, be on the agenda on the corporate boards and also for the financial institutions. So I think that's one challenge. Be very clear about including not only public but private sector, and try to create that simple framework. The second is what you also said, Simon, and a lesson learned from the, what we see on climate is this second body. How can we also not only look at resource mobilization from public and private sector, but also hold sort of existing harmful financial flows? I would say most global financial capital moves around with little recognition of its impact or dependency on nature. It has sort of shifted when we talk about climate, and most people recognize at least and are trying to assess the climate risk, but there is a huge unawareness when it comes to nature. So I think that's the sort of the second leg, if you like. And how can we get there? Well, it's the same tools that we used when we try to mobilize for climate, in my mind. Try to put a price on externalities. Try to establish some kind of framework that could put some price on externalities. Secondly, try to establish, we talked about how the central banks mobilized in terms of putting in place a regulatory framework, creating that sense of urgency from a completely new angle is important. And thirdly, providing more and more data in order to give more transparency into the process, and also make it easier for us as a private sector actor to really demonstrate that we are, for instance, deforestation free, or how we really can measure improvement with biodiversity. So I think I'll stop there, but there are really these two elements that need to interact.
Erik, thank you very much indeed for that kind of first round. Clearly, our ecosystem of rules and actors is getting more complicated as we talk. Now we have issues to do with pricing natural assets and capital and risks and so on, to layer into what needs to happen in terms of financial rules, actions by regulators and so on, linked to, of course, ultimately back to where CBD and the critical role of the negotiators can play a role. Really complicated. I guess, Erik-Jan, if I was to double guess what your next sentence might be in thinking about the world of financial actors around you, you then add, and could you make it all really simple so that we can do it easily each day? And I won't prompt you for that, but that's obviously the challenge, moving complexity to simplicity in order for the financial community and the wider business community to do this without having a PhD and a large science department kind of down the road. So thanks a lot. Onno, I'm going to come on to you. Yet another piece of the story. You straddle many different worlds. You operate within a UN and international environment. You operate at a country level specifically, but at many countries across the world. And obviously you engage with the financial and business community. Help us understand in a nutshell how the sorts of comments you've heard from the previous three speakers kind of lands in a place and what that means in practice.
Thank you so much for that question, Simon. And I think that if you look at the national or country perspective, I think that if we want to introduce this concept of alignment, the first thing we want to do is see how are we doing so far. So we can start to measure alignment of finance flows with biodiversity from the past years. And this can be done for both the public and the private sector. And a lot of countries already did this, less so for the private sector, but the Netherlands gives us a very good example there. But the ones that have been done are largely about the biodiversity positive impacts. And if you look at the biodiversity negative spending, actually very few countries have sort of ventured in trying to measure those. So this is a bit more of a sort of black box for now. And then once we want to improve the alignment, we can work with the financial sector. I think TNFD was already mentioned. This is one of the most important tools to reveal how financial institutes, commercial banks, and their finance flows are already aligned. Because when we did, for example, private sector expenditure reviews, 95% of companies basically had no information about this. So we have good hopes that TNFD will change that. But there are also other tools that can be used. For example, Sri Lanka has developed a sustainable finance strategy. It's a kind of roadmap to align their finance towards a number of sustainability objectives. And this includes biodiversity and climate and others. And that is led by the central bank, but also involves a number of other critical financial institutes. And another entry point that can be used is to look from the perspective of public budgets. We can apply a concept of what we call results-based budgeting. So if we take the targets that are right now being discussed for the Global Biodiversity Framework, the first step that countries will undertake is to calibrate them, to nationalize them, and develop their own national biodiversity plan and their own national targets. And once we have those targets, we can then generate important baseline data. But more importantly, we can also study the issue of alignment, because we can integrate those targets into our budgeting and expenditure system. That's a system that we call budget tagging. And this is something that several countries already did, for example, Malawi or Cuba. But we should not only look at our budgets and our accounting systems, but before that, we should look at our planning. So it's really critical that we're going to look at the national level and look at our national plans, development plans, and, for example, NDCs, and also make sure that they are fully aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework. And yet another useful entry point is looking at subsidies. We all know that around $500 billion per year is spent on things that harm nature. So how can we ensure better alignment there? Well, we can first of all study the positive or negative impact from our current subsidies, and then help to what we call repurpose them to make them more biodiversity positive. But in that process, trying to not lose the positive socioeconomic impacts that those subsidies already have. And as well, this one-time screening and repurposing is important, but it's also important that we stop creating those nature-blind subsidies. So we have to help countries to develop very strong analytical and screening frameworks so that any new subsidy that's created is already by default scanned on its impact on nature and not on a case-by-case basis. So these are some of the various entry points that exist, and there are also others. And what we're doing under BioFin is bringing a number of those entry points together under what we call a national biodiversity finance plan. And I just want to highlight here as well that this kind of alignment work is something that's a high priority of the GF, and they're actually just working on what they call early action grants to support countries with this. And that's something that many countries will wish to take up. So I think in short, what we need is a multidimensional approach to the issue of alignment, looking at both the positive and negative flows. And we also need a multi-stakeholder approach, working with the public and private sector and with environment and finance communities. Back to you, Simon.
Brilliant, Onno, thank you. And I think I would sort of also inevitably join the dots even more, adding to the complication but the opportunity that public finance doesn't exist independently from private finance. Yeah, and so what governments choose to do and spend their money on is not just a matter of policy and regulation and rules and standards, but what they choose to invest in, what they choose to finance, what they choose to support, has a huge influence on how the private financial community and the broader business community see opportunities and channel funds. So I think one's got to see the linkage across from, Onno, your points to what the world that Eric Young sits in and the regulatory environment that Rachel and Sylvie have been talking about. Good. So we've gone the first round, and I would say anyone on the call who has been paying attention will go, okay, I get it. This is really important. The opportunity is there. We can learn from climate, and we can really catapult forward in aligning global finance with nature. And then they'll go, but I don't have any of those jobs. I'm a negotiator. You know, I have a very specific set of levers and a particular set of processes. So I'm going to put the panel on the spot, and with an eye on the time and Odile giving me the evil eye, I'm going to ask each of you perhaps to offer really just a sort of 1 minute blast on, given this opportunity, what is it really that CBD can deliver? What are the levers that are open to negotiators who are not sitting in the market, that are not doing what you're doing, Onno, that are not thinking about regulators? You know, what is it that they can do? And Sylvie, I'll start with you. We are timing out, so I'm going to keep you each to a maximum of a minute. Just sort of help the CBD negotiators figure, how do I turn that insight into practice in what I do? Over to you, Sylvie. Okay, I'm going to come back to Sylvie if she can get back on the line. Rachel, I'll start with you. Sylvie, pause for a second.
All right, well, something that maybe others won't say is that a lot of money is running away from what it doesn't want to be invested in, and it's having trouble running to what it does want to invest in. So everything that the CBD negotiators have to do is make it easier for private and public finance to, with 4 words in mind, be able to invest in that which we want it to invest in. So the 4 words are credibility, integrity, transparency, and accountability. So everything the CBD needs to do needs to smooth that pathway. And we have to regulate, or we have to govern for the world that is coming, not the world that used to be. And there we have extraordinary opportunities now for digital MRV. We have many new fintech digital companies that have extraordinary capability using machine learning and AI to basically be able to verify all the way down global supply chains what the quality of an asset is. And that can be used in voluntary use of carbon markets or many other end-to-end products and services which haven't been invented yet. So if the CBD negotiators can imagine that world, then they can help us move there.
Rachel, thank you very much. I'm going to check in once more to see if Sylvie has managed to get back online. I'll take that as a maybe and move on to you, Eric Jan, for your kind of 1 minute. What do CBD negotiators in practice need to do to build on what you've said?
Well, point number 1, I think a strong recognition of the role that private capital plays. Point number 2, I think to make sure that, like the Article 2.1c gave financial institutions a clear signal that was loud and clear on climate, and we need the same signal on nature. And thirdly, to what extent governments or multinational institutions can support getting more data on the table, bringing more transparency on the table that can help us redirect capital.
Fantastic, Eric. Very, very practical, super helpful. Focus on data, focus on metrics, focus on traceability, focus really on building an ecosystem that allows visibility on what's really going on. Drive innovation, drive rules and regulations that count. Super helpful. Onno, same question to you.
I'm going to try to be also very practical. So I think my first recommendation for the negotiators is to become bilingual. You have to speak the language of the finance sector, learn about issues like risks, angel investors, this whole spectrum. You can do it. There's still time before the COP. And I think this is part of a broader bridge that we want to build between the finance and the biodiversity community. So we need to strengthen the capacity of the conservation community to deal with finance. And likewise, we need to strengthen the capacity of the finance community to deal with nature. And as well, a very practical tip is there's still time to talk to the finance sector in your country. So pick up the phone, talk to your finance ministry, set up a meeting, run through these goals, get their feedback, bring that feedback to the COP, and see this as a starting point and continue the same story with implementation. I think from now on, it's important that finance and environment ministries are handling this issue jointly and not in silos.
Oh no, well said. Translation, multilingualism, love it. Absolutely spot on. One more attempt. Sylvie, are you with us or have you not managed to get back online?
There.
Okay. So Sylvie, did you hear what the last question was? Great. So I'm going to limit, I'm afraid, again to about a minute if you can offer a piece of wisdom to the negotiators given what we've heard today. No, we can't hear you. We can now. We can see you, but can't hear you. So if you can do sign language, now would be the moment. Yes.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Ah, this is so stressful. I'm sorry, because I'm so distracted by the technology that I'm not paying enough attention to my own
really
answer. So no, I'm the one to be sorry. Well, it's going to be very simple in a nutshell. Have the right wording in the text that will make it very clear and simple to the private and the public decision makers. And I think in that regard, the Article 2.3c in the Paris Agreement, which stated that financial flows need to be aligned with development that is going to be low carbon, was instrumental. It was crystal clear. You cannot imagine the number of people coming up afterwards to me and others saying, well, then we have to do it. My God, yes, you have to do it. And so I would say have this as a kind of overarching high-level aspirational goal in the text. Probably would say a lot to the private sector as well as to the public sector. And as we said, and as I said, it's not just private, it's also public. And greening the budget, for instance, is one thing, and et cetera, et cetera. So sorry, I was a little out of the scope from my previous answer, but I hope it helped.
Thank you, Sylvie. So firstly, I'm going to thank you all very much. It was a race through a complex and exciting topic. Maybe just a couple of closing remarks, and then Odile, I apologize for a couple of minutes out, and I'll pass back to you to move on. So, you know, I'm hoping that we can use this and following sessions to do really what Onu says, which is to build multilingualism, an understanding between these different domains, without which it sort of is a little bit hard to figure out how to make the connection. And I do think in the climate space, we made significant progress and continue to do so in building linguistic and understanding between these different parts of the story that are mutually independent. Secondly, picking up on various comments, stronger narrative, recognition of the private sector, target setting, get the text right, focus on data, very, very practical things that really can move forward thanks to a productive and energetic CBD process. And I guess I would simply conclude with perhaps one remark, which is in such negotiations, you know, we often tend to default to a language of mobilization. And mobilization is sort of cash in the bank. You know, it's like somebody's going to give us some money that we can do something with. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with a language of mobilization. It's really critical part of the story. But the language of alignment speaks to a far greater volume of resources. I mean, by an order of magnitude, $400 trillion sitting across financial and capital markets, not every piece of which impacts nature, but certainly an awful lot that does. And so getting alignment is in fact a macro approach to mobilization. It's a macro approach to moving much larger volumes of money, not through your own personal or institutional bank account, but shifting the way in which it responds to nature. So I would plead that we don't imagine mobilization to be one side and alignment to be another side, but see the really critical linkages between the two. So thanks once again to the panel. Odile, I apologize, we're several minutes over time, and I pass it back to you.
No problem, Simon. Thank you. Thank you for your very good moderation, and thank you to all panelists for sharing your views on aligning flows, on the needs, and for your excellent participation. So I think that now the main ideas behind this alignment are much clearer, and we will now move directly to the second panel, where we will speak on the operationalization, that's a complicated word for French people, on this alignment issue. As you said, the question of whether to act is no longer an issue, as you have said during the first panel, but what we will discuss in this second panel is how to act for the financial sector, for the public and the private financial sector. We will have panelists from both sides and try to perhaps fill the gap that Ono Van Evel said during the first panel, and others also, of this language and bilingual aspect. So how is it possible to manage the risk and impact of the operation in the financial sector and in the value chain also? What is it, a nature positive project? Is it bankable? What are doing now the financial sector? Which sectors are most important or most affected? Where will I find, as you said, data, metrics, standards? Which type? What are the current tools developed now? How will international and national policies, as we heard in the first panel, help us as financial sector? So for that, the second panel will illustrate with concrete examples and projects what their companies are already doing in biodiversity or intend to do. They will express their needs and expectation regarding governments and parties and the CBD negotiation, and they will link these actions also to the need of parties. I am pleased to introduce a very diverse and interesting panel representing the public and private financial sector and also the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. Mrs. Marius Calvé is the Director of Sustainability and Responsible Investment of Grupo Financiero Banorte in Mexico. Good morning, Marius. Mrs. Emily Mackenzie is the Technical Director of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. Mr. Gilles Cletz is the Head of Ecological Transition Department at the French Agency of Development. And Mr. Qingfeng Zhang is Officer in charge of the Environment Thematic Group and Chief of the Rural Department and Food Security Thematic Group at the Asian Development Bank. So, Gilles, I will begin with you. At the first workshop in June that we organized, it was clearly mentioned that the public financial sector, the development bank, had a critical role to play to recognizing biodiversity as a key development issue and to specify it in their mandate, how to manage the risk, impact, and dependencies, as well as the financing at scale of nature positive projects. We heard just before the role of the public finance in this area and the link also with the private finance. So Gilles, can you tell us what you are doing at the French Agency of Development, and also more broadly, how these ideas and actions are spreading within the public bilateral development banks community? Gilles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Odile, and thanks again to the Secretariat of the CBD for bringing up this workshop on this key topic. Aligning our financial institutions to the CBD objectives means for us making sure that our activity produces positive gains to biodiversity. So for a public development bank such as AFD, which manages an asset of about 50 billion and commits yearly between 12 to 15 billion around the world, what does it mean? How do we strive to achieve net positive gains to biodiversity? Well, first, we've established a bank-wide strategy, a roadmap, to make sure that we have a quantified objective of improved impact on biodiversity. For example, we've decided to commit 1 billion of finance to biodiversity activities. We've committed to convergence between climate and biodiversity agenda. Secondly, we have committed to respond to the country's request for finance by promoting nature-based solution in every sectors, in every activities where it's possible, where it's justified, where it actually makes sense in terms of economics, bankability, and social and other co-benefits. So for example, this means promoting nature-based solutions for water sanitation, for coastal management, green cities, agroecology, sustainable management of resources, ecosystem restoration, etc., as much as possible. Thirdly, I think what is key is trying to track biodiversity finance much more precisely. Tracking biodiversity finance is easy when you're talking about conservation finance. It's more difficult when you're talking about mainstreamed activities. So now we do that, and we have a precise tool to help us quantify the biodiversity co-benefits of mainstreamed activity. Second, and fourthly, I think one key aspect is really strengthening our safeguards. And this is, of course, making sure that we apply the performance standards of IFC globally, but maybe sometimes move beyond that in terms of making sure we don't hurt critical habitats, making sure we are not linked to any risk of deforestation, etc. Finally, the sixth point, I think, is really engaging proactively with the double materiality of financial risk linked to biodiversity, i.e. both our impact and our dependence. And because public development bank usually work in high biodiversity areas with high risk related to that, this is particularly important, and we are moving ahead in that direction. Another key point for alignment is data, as we have seen and heard already. So we are starting a movement called Data for Nature, where we would like to encourage all public development banks to actually share the data that is generated by their impact, environmental impact assessment on biodiversity, share that with the GBIF and with the Global Biodiversity information facility, so that it's publicly available for all. I think another key aspect of our alignment is measuring the impacts of blended finance on biodiversity. We have been promoting blended finance for impact on biodiversity for over 15 years. We need to measure its impact, compare impact per euro spent in these instruments. It's absolutely key to upscale these issues. And finally, all this, to answer your last point, Odile, is really about disseminating these different bricks of what it means practically to be aligned with the CBD. And we do that through our community of public development banks, especially the bilateral ones, through our club, the International Development Finance Club, by putting together what we call a toolbox that really helps these banks, these peer banks, equip themselves with all these different blocks of what we consider constitute alignment. And I will conclude this by saying that I think public development banks are a place where there is bilingual activity going on, because it's a place where there is finance expertise, obviously, but often as well biodiversity expertise, and the teams do speak to each other, and that's how we come up with these innovative blocks that can very practically and quite simply answer to the objective of being aligned with the CBD objectives as a financial institution. Thanks.
Thank you, Gilles. If I don't want to summarize what you said, but what some very interesting point of what public development banks and above all AFD is doing. The first one is to respond to countries' requests, working with them directly and explaining and working and answering to their needs. Also, that's really important in terms of biodiversity. Working also with the private sector. The first panel also mentioned that, so also the blended finance, trying to addressing risk by applying the safeguards and also financing new and nature positive project. And finally, measuring what you are doing, tracking finance, as you say, and providing for that data. So the full picture is there, more or less. And thanks for that. Now we'll go to the to the multilateral development bank. We stay on the public side with Mr. Zhang. Mr. Zhang, do you also speak this bilingual, these two speeches? And during the COP26 in Glasgow, all the multilateral development banks have, for the first time, issued a joint statement on nature. That was an incredible progress. And can you tell us more about this statement and how you, at the ASEAN Development Bank, are implementing it or plan to implement it in relation also with the countries in your geographical area? Thank you, Mr. Zhang.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Audio?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Firstly, I want to quickly to share the reason we have a statement on nature and COP26 is a sort of the common ground or common understanding, the nature and the climate alignment, because there is a, in the past is a sort of a long mindset, say let's wait until the the solution find out for climate change, and then we can address biodiversity loss. But because we understand the biodiversity loss is so closely associated with the climate change, but biodiversity loss is contributing to the climate change, and the climate change is a key driver of the biodiversity loss as well. So we have the land MDBs, including ADB. We agree to mainstream the nature into our operations, and the signing the statement on nature and the COP26, the climate change. So let me come back to pick up the point you just mentioned about Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific, one of course is the largest number of the poor people and rather severely affected by the COVID-19. But sometimes it's also some of the richest concentrations of the Earth biodiversity as well. It's home to the nearly 17 of the 66 of the Earth biodiversity hotspots. It is very rich. So Asia Development Bank is the largest regional development bank here in Asia. Of course, to implement the statement of the nature, I think we speak the same language with not only just among our MDBs, but many of our bilateral dollars, like FD, like I just say, quite similar with us, our language as well. I think it's the three key elements that we are going to develop this nature positive investment roadmap to provide the strategic direction to better value and integrate the nature into our operations. The first element is provide the blueprint for the sort of the pure biodiversity investment project, what is directly related to the nature positive investment. So we have the four kinds of key initiatives launched just the last few years, and including also COP15 and also COP26. Number one, of course, ADB is one of the first bank to launch the action plan for healthy ocean and sustainable blue economies. We launched a $5 billion program for the ocean health. Number two is we launched the East Asia and also Australia Asia Flyway Initiative. They are in their COP15. We are target to mobilize $3 billion to support this wayland associated with this flyway. And of course, we're going to continue the Great Mekong region biodiversity conservation corridor initiative. Finally, we are working on the new program, Innovative Nature Capital Financing Facility, to transform agricultural food system in the Asia. This is the one element. The second element is quite similar with the FD, is that we provide the guidance to mainstream the biodiversity and the nature-based solutions in one of our infrastructure projects, including the transport, ports, energy, water, and also the open development. One of the key example we developed is a sort of the spawn city in number of our DMC already. And the third element is also the tracking, reporting the natural positive investment, and also the mitigate the risk, financial risk in biodiversity loss. The RELO will work with the other MDPs to develop the consensus or the same methodology for the metrics and also the methodology. One of this roadmap and also key initiative going to be supported by the development of ADB's Asia Pacific Natural Capital Lab to incubate, accelerate, and expand the natural capital investment through the three key elements. One is, of course, natural capital accounting, where RELO support the number of the country introduces a gross ecosystem product. Two is introduces equal compensation or payment for ecological services, shift away from the harmful subsidy. Finally, is mobilize the brand financing to develop this bankable project. Probably let me just pause here. We can further discuss. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang, to explain us what the Multilateral Development Bank and above all the Asian Development Bank is doing. I just keep some words more than perhaps was said before. The link with climate, the link also with social issues, and as development banks, AFD and the ASEAN, it's also a development issue and a very, very important thing. And also the fact that you are working on developing either methodologies or also report and studies on valuing nature, on tools also and guidance for your clients, also on nature-based solution. It comes very often in the discussions that you all have. The link with climate is there everywhere, and the fact that you are also mainstreaming biodiversity in a lot of sectors. You also mentioned cities. So thanks a lot. Now we are going to the private sector with Marius Calvé. Marius Calvé, you represent here the private financial sector, which is a lot because it accounts for 80% of global finance in the world. Your role is extremely important, that this was mentioned apart from the public sector during the first panel, to fight against biodiversity loss, I would say beyond climate, because it's perhaps more pregnant in the private sector, and to support the transition of the economic sector you are financing by financing projects that are positive with nature. So Banorte is one of the active players in Latin America. I would like that you explain us what you are also doing in terms of management of your risk, dependency, and impact on nature, and how you are also increasing your finance for biodiversity. And perhaps a last question. As it was said before, the Global Biodiversity Framework, once adopted, will be translated into policies and regulation, as we have seen in France, for example. Are you ready for this? How will you respond to this perhaps regulation coming in your countries or other? And what are your needs and expectations for that? Thank you, Marius.
Thank you very much, Odile. I'm very excited to be here with my co-panelists, with you, Odile, and to previously listen to the wonderful panel, and to Simon, of course. So, well, as you were saying, and part of the question, it included the topic of linking the biodiversity agenda to the climate agenda. I agree. My first message is that we need to understand how the world faces the interconnected crisis of climate change, but of biodiversity loss and human development inequalities. So financial institutions, for us, it is expected that we include our nature positive commitments along with our net zero commitments. In our case, in Banorte, we are part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, so we need to include our nature positive targets and commitments alongside the climate strategy. As Simon said in the previous panel, the agenda has been kept a little behind of the climate agenda. This is something we all know, but we need to increase the ambition on the topic of nature. So as you were saying, Odile, what we're trying to do is that we are trying to develop a biodiversity strategy that is included in or alongside our climate strategy or our general ESG strategy. We are a very large financial group in Mexico that is very public, and we have a whole set of universe of 4,000 investors which are pushing for many topics, and mostly on the topic of the net zero strategy. So we need to include and develop our biodiversity strategy within these strategies. We have been applying internationally accepted biodiversity safeguards to our lending, including the IFC Performance Standard 6. We are an Equator Principles signatory, and but we need to increase our financing of nature positive projects, and so we need to develop market pipelines that result in initiatives like maybe incubators, pilots, accelerator funds, or seeds funding, as many countries have done. We need to develop adequate financial innovations, maybe like green bonds, blended finance, and new asset classes. And we believe that we need to allocate a percentage of our climate finance to biodiversity financing. This would be the key, actually, to allocate funds to nature positive. And it's important to set a percentage of what we are trying to allocate for climate finance to biodiversity financing. And of course, we need to measure, report, and disclose on our nature-related risks, impacts, dependencies, and that's why we are one of the members of the TNFD. Also, we need to keep working on conducting stress tests of our portfolios, not only on the climate side, but on biodiversity. So what are the needs and what are the challenges? Well, we all know that one of the main needs that we understand is the topic of capacities. There's not a clear understanding of biodiversity as a systemic risk. We need a lot more integral training on biodiversity and how to link it with our climate strategy. We do not understand yet, there's no internal knowledge on biodiversity dependencies and outcomes, and how to minimize biodiversity loss and how to restore. So one of our needs would be to actually develop in-house knowledge and expertise regarding the sectors that have significant negative impact on biodiversity. Of course, the side of regulation, which is not the only part, but regulation that incentivizes the topic of nature positive is something that I would say it's a challenge or a need, and also the understanding of what are the opportunities of new nature positive products and services. In Mexico, we had last year from the central bank, the Mexican central bank has been very active on NGFS and on the work on biodiversity. So last year they launched with UNDP diagnostic study as to how financial institutions in Mexico are included environmental and climate risk in their strategies. So this was a very thorough report. They actually interviewed most of the formal banks in Mexico from the Mexican Bank Association, that are around 50 banks, and I think most of them were interviewed. Also investors, insurance companies. And this report, interestingly, ended with very precise recommendation from the governor of the Bank of Mexico to the CEOs of financial institutions, which we envision are like the first step towards the regulation that will be coming up. And also, just to end, in Mexico last year also, there was a creation of a green finance council from the regulators of the financial sector. So the first regulation that is coming up starting next year is a regulation for investors to include environmental and social risks in their decisions formally. But we are looking at regulation coming up very soon in the markets and for banks. So if we are ready, I think that we are not. We need a lot of training, a lot of capacities, a lot of understanding on managing and disclosing our nature-related risks. But I think that things are moving fast. We're learning from organizations around the world doing a lot. So that would be my overview. Thank you, Adil.
Thank you, Marius, for this, I would say, testimony that's really honest and transparent and really interesting. We see clearly that you are coming as many private financial sector from the climate area to the biodiversity. Now the willingness is there, and you are really committed being in TNFD and so on. But as you said, you need perhaps more awareness, more knowledge, more expertise, partnership links. We see that the regulation will be there and important. That's the central banks, and so there is such a call from you, but there are also developing studies and research, as Simon said during the first panel, on biodiversity, also defining the risk, and the risk also to not act on the financial stability. So things are moving a lot, but we see that the private financial sector, perhaps more than the public, has a lot of needs of tools, data, metrics, and also knowledge. So it's a good transition to our last panelist, Emily. Emily, so you are the new technical director of the new TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. The task of the TNFD, and you will explain that perhaps more precisely, is to help the financial sector, the private mainly, but surely also the public, to assess and disclose what they are doing in terms of biodiversity, mainly the nature-related risks, impact and dependencies, but also the opportunities of financing. So can you perhaps explain us what is this new TNFD, why it's important also for the CBD negotiator to understand how it will help them also to make biodiversity, if I can say, advance, and what you are currently developing. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adil, and the CBD Secretariat. It's a real pleasure to be part of this workshop, and in particular to follow Gilles from AFD, who's been supporting the TNFD AFD with a development finance network, bringing together development finance institutions from the public sector to support TNFD, and also Marius, who is a member of the task force. So she's one of the leaders within the task force driving forward the work I'm about to describe, and to meet my new colleague at the ADB. So pleasure to be here. So ultimately, what the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, is trying to do is to support this shift in global financial flows, both public and private, from activities that harm nature, away from those activities and towards those that help nature thrive. And so very specifically to achieve this goal, it's helping to get there by developing a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and to act on evolving risks that are coming from nature loss. And so, of course, this is fundamental to the CBD, very aligned with what the CBD and the CBD's biodiversity framework, the goals and targets within it. What we'll actually be producing, I think it's helpful to kind of distinguish, to make it feel real, two elements. So we plan to develop a set of disclosure requirements that will be aligned with the TCFD. So alignment with TCFD is very important to us. I can speak a little bit about that later. And second, a kind of practical framework for how to manage nature-related risks and opportunities. How, step by step, how do you understand how you impact nature, how you depend on it, and how that leads to both risks and opportunities for business and for financial organizations. So the TNFD, the task force, is not building a standard. It aims to establish and promote the adoption of an integrated risk management framework and these disclosure recommendations. And it will draw on the best existing relevant tools and data platforms and metrics, and aims for this framework, once established, to then be used within existing standards. So of course, there's the nuts and bolts of producing the framework, which will keep us very busy over the next 2 years, but also building momentum for market adoption, so driving uptake of this and seeing that from the get-go. So yeah, the TNFD has been endorsed by G7 finance ministers and mentioned by the G20 climate and environment ministers already. And I think what I'd like to emphasize here, I guess, is really critical is one principle is that what we produce is usable by the market. So this is achieved in practical terms through the market-led approach, having Maria's and others from business, from financial institutions, building the framework supported by knowledge partners and by the Secretariat where I sit. And so at the centre is the task force. With the 34 now, we will hope to build 35 members and with 2 co-chairs. And one of our co-chairs with a very specific link to the CBD is Elizabeth Marema, the Executive Secretary. And so I think I just mentioned a little bit about how we're linking to TCFD. So what we want to do as we design this framework is to harness synergies in the framework design. And I think I heard a previous speaker on the last panel, Sylvie, talk about those pillars. So we'll be aligned with the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework and want to be very complementary to really rapidly improve uptake in the market. The other thing we're doing to build on other principles we have for building on what's already out there and enabling testing and consultation is to follow what we're calling an open innovation approach. So we're going to put out a first high-level version of the framework in the first quarter of next year, and then subsequently put more built out releases through to the final version coming out at the end of 2023. And so within that, gradually we'll populate with more substance. Obviously, many of the things that have been spoken in the previous panel and this one are going to be fundamental for us in building the framework. We'll need to be thinking about data and data platforms, metrics and guidance on targets. Over time, I imagine the framework will get further populated with guidance for sectors and scenarios. So really getting into the kind of crunchy details of how do you manage these risks and in informing decision making along the get-go. So that work is already underway. We have 5 working groups already formed in the task force who are deep into the work on definitions, data, standards and metrics, as well as building to this first release of the framework, the beta release in Q1 next year, and developing a methodology for pilot testing. So we really want to have a raft of pilots that test the framework and give us feedback so we can be very open and improve it not once it's finalized, but from very early versions. So you asked about the second question, sort of relating to the CBD biodiversity framework before I finish. So I mean, I was thinking about what the relationship between TNFD and CBD and the biodiversity framework. For me, I was thinking of like the yin and yang philosophy from ancient Chinese philosophy, because some might think that these things are contrary forces, but actually they're completely complementary and interconnected. I mean, I guess in my mind, I think the CBD biodiversity framework sets this fundamentally important high-level frame, and some of the previous speakers on the other panel talked about the need for it to be specific and relevant and galvanize action by the private sector. So I think it's absolutely critical. It needs to set clear goals and targets that can galvanize what needs to be done, and that will set this umbrella for the TNFD. Meanwhile, the CBD needs the TNFD as one of its tools to enable the financial flows from the private and, as you said, also the public sector to have clear standards, metrics, data, things that they can do to manage the risks that emerge from nature loss. So it's a way of operationalizing, I think, what the CBD goals and helping to achieve them. And there are a number of obvious targets, but really the TNFD, I hope, can help to achieve a range of targets within that framework.
Thank you, Emily, for the presentation of the TNFD. It's more and more known, but I hope that it will be clear for everyone what is it and how useful it will be for the private and public financial sector, but also for the negotiation and the work on the way in terms of biodiversity. So now, the idea is to go further in depth in what you are doing and in what you are financing, and explain to us and illustrate more and more concretely what you are doing on the ground. I would say what you are financing and what we can call a biodiversity project. I will ask you to present one project, if possible, quickly, because I would really ask you at the end, what are your expectations on the upcoming COP 15 and GBF? So please go in this, present us a very concrete project, and after that we have some time. Marius, you're the first. Can you explain what you are doing currently in terms of biodiversity in Mexico?
Thank you. I'll try to be concrete. As you know, we're a financial group with the second largest bank in Mexico, the largest pension fund, a mutual fund company, but an insurance company too. So I'm going to just mention briefly about a place where we saw an opportunity for action. We can, of course, always work on the topic of debt, of equity, but we saw that we could boost a new approach through insurance to de-risk and to manage risks on the topic of nature. So we launched a parametric insurance. As you know, this is an index-based cover that is gaining traction, and this is related to a weather-related event, to a hurricane. So what we did is we covered an area of the coast and the coral reefs alongside the Quintana Roo state in Mexico, which is one of the most diverse in biodiverse in the country. So as you know, a parametric insurance for infrastructure requires a geolocation with precise coordinates. But if you are trying to insure kilometers and kilometers of a coast and all the natural ecosystem around the coast and the coral reefs, we had to define a polygon to actually locate the area. So this is to draw a polygon of all the area that we're trying to cover. So what happened is that the Nature Conservancy helped to define the area to cover in the state of Quintana Roo. And we defined a trust for the integrated management of the coastal zone. It has a very large name, this trust, but it was managed by the Ministry of Finance of the state of Quintana Roo, by the Ministry of Natural Resources, and also a technical committee as to how to use the funds in case of the occurrence of a hurricane within certain parameters. Of course, as you know, we need to state some parameters as to the wind and the duration of the wind and the speed of the wind. So actually a hurricane occurred in September of last year, and this actually helped to see many other clients, not only a government but private clients, that this is a very interesting way to protect nature but also infrastructure with the use of a parametric insurance. So this is something that started in 2020. We increased the polygon of coverage from 2020 to 2021. So we want to keep going with this parametric insurance to protect the coast and the nature coral reef.
Thank you, Marius. In the insurance area, we see a lot of really interesting things arriving in the way to manage the risk and in the way also to developing new products. What is interesting also in what you said, it is interesting, but is the link with TNC and with NGOs. Also, we've seen that very often with the most advanced, if I can say, private banks, the link with some other knowledge parties, and very often some NGOs. It's also a way to fill the gap of awareness and perhaps expertise that you mentioned during your first intervention. Mr. Zhang, can you explain, give us an example, a concrete example also of what the Asian Development Bank is financing? In China, I think, your example.
Yeah, I can start there. Yeah, definitely. End of the day, I need to give the concrete example to China, but I think I started with the key initiative we launched, the COP15, the regional flyway initiative. Many of you probably already know that we have the ambition to protect and restore 30 crucial wetlands along the largest migratory roads in Asia and to the Australia-Asia flyway. Through this correlation of partnerships with a number of our colleagues, including FD, Jerris is also here, IDB is seeking to mobilize about $3 billion in investments for protection, maintenance, restoration of the wetlands in the East Asia and also Southeast Asia region. Of course, very much focused on coastal wetlands. So I want to just quickly to go into the very concrete example. One of the wetlands where ADB already invested. As an example, we're going to replicate this wetland to the rest of the treaty land wetlands. One of the wetlands ADB already invested is the Jiangsu Yancheng Wetlands Protection Project, which is located along the Yangtze River and also associated with the Jiru Sea as well. In 2011, ADB provided $37 million lending and also combined with the Global Environmental Facility grant, $2.5 million to support the restoration of these wetlands. This is a sort of a natural reserve, is the home of endangered birds of the animals, including a mule deer, which is one of key species already close to the extinction already. And of course, is another red-crowned crane, which is also a sort of a very international significant in the IUCN red list already. So this is a natural reserve is internationally recognized for its importance. So from the ADB end, this $37 million lending plus this $2.5 million, we are basically support the number of the key elements, including ecological farming, reduces the chemical use in their agriculture area. Number two is wetland rehabilitation and restoration. Number three is control of invasive species, which is a spotted tuna. Many of you are probably quite familiar already. And also the pilot and the demonstration of what we call is ecological compensation, and also the sustainable use of the ecological services, and also including the forest management and ecotourism. So from this project, two things very critical from ADB, and of course we share with a number of the partners already. The number one is a very essential to balance the needs between the nature and also the livelihoods. You just imagine that many of this area is quite poor. Another one is very essential to introduce a sustainable financing mechanism to make this type of the investment more bankable and also sustainable. Probably let me just pause here. Of course, I have many of the elements I can elaborate, including how we can link this project with the Flyway initiative with our regional natural capital lab, which incorporate natural capital accounting, and also to help the DMC shift away from the harmful subsidy to the payment for ecological services, and also introduces the brand financing. One of the elements also is combine to make the type of the projects is bankable, but is quite in depth already. So I think today, considering the time constraints, I don't need to go into detail. But again, this Flyway initiative recognized as a game changer in the COP15, considering the size of investment and also the widespread of the Flyway landscape. Let me just pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang, for this very interesting and broad example on restoration, on wetlands, on partnerships also. Gilles, perhaps can you also explain what IFD is financing and what it means for you, a bankable project? I think that's what you wanted to say to all of us.
Sure. I mean, the key issue of promoting nature-based solutions and biodiversity positive solution when answering the request by governments is really to transform biodiversity neutral or negative projects into biodiversity positive solutions. For example, in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, where there is a lot of coastal erosion, It's a low-lying area with a lot of impact from rising seas and more frequent extreme weather events. And a classical answer would have to be concrete dikes and concrete gray structure, infrastructure. And we've decided together in a discussion with the Vietnamese government that we would really do a sort of ecological and ecosystem-based resilience coastal management approach. So we transformed a sort of gray infrastructure type of classical answer into something far more integrated that actually rebuilds mangroves and coastal ecosystems. Gives that as well strong management and involvement of local communities so that they own their ecosystem, proving as well not just ecological resilience, but social resilience as well. So this is an example of what I call promoting nature-based solution. We have a few other examples like this in, for example, the distant suburb of Dakar in Senegal, where there is huge problem of really very weak and low water tables because of intense use. And we have decided rather to build dams and in artificial infrastructures only to as well invest in restoring forest ecosystem and savanna ecosystem to favor natural infiltration and restocking of water tables for better use, associated, of course, with more managed and controlled use of these water tables based on social and local organization. These types of projects are usually, you know, financed through soft loans or grants, and altogether they build up to about 600 million per year for AFD. So this is what we call the biodiversity co-benefits of our activity, and it altogether represents quite a growing percentage of our activity. And the idea is really, as you see, to transform biodiversity neutral development activities into biodiversity positive, bankable development activity that really produces positive co-benefits for biodiversity, and to make sure that we grow from an area where we only finance conservation, which for public development banks is always a tiny portion because it's highly dependent on granting and so on. Sometimes it's really not the business so much of public development banks, into something much wider, usually 20, 30, 40% of the portfolio that has some biodiversity impact, positive, but yet are addressing key social infrastructure development issues with strong economic returns as well. That's really the idea. So I think in this effort, you know, in the big 800 billion finance gap for biodiversity, public development banks can really address a key part of that, not just conservation finance, but mostly the rest, which is really greening finance and making sure that we actually support a biodiversity positive development choices and pathways.
Thank you, Gilles. That's really all of you. Experience and project of all of you are really encouraging, and by your example, Gilles, I think you are mostly saying that you are supporting your client from shifting from business as usual, if I could say, to nature positive project by giving and by finding with them, not giving, but finding with them new solutions to address more or less the same risk, but with new and innovative solution based on biodiversity. That's really, really encouraging. And I think all the examples we had today were really good. Emilie, I come back to you for the last example. How will you measure that? How will you translate that in a framework? Perhaps very quickly, can you give us a frame of what beta framework and will contain, if it's possible now? It's a bit early, or perhaps of the first pilot that you are developing?
Yeah, sure. I hope that if I was at this session, this time next year, I have a raft of examples I could give. But as you said, it's a new initiative, and so we have projects to speak to. But I thought I could just give a little bit more detail of the framework and the working groups that are underway with a focus on the pilot testing. So as I mentioned, I think what will specifically be put out by the TNFD will be this set of disclosure recommendations and this framework for analysis of impacts, dependencies on nature, and identification of nature-related risks and how to manage them. And for me, the flip side of risk is always opportunity. If you're understanding nature-related risks, you're going to also be understanding the case for the opportunities for investing in nature to help manage those risks. So I would hope that application of the TNFD framework will encourage these kinds of projects we just heard about from Gilles, Mariaz, and Mr. Zhang. The work that we're doing, the really specific nuts and bolts work of these 5 working groups I mentioned, is one, to start really thinking through the definitions. How do we define nature and related concepts that are fundamental to the CBD? And we're drawing a lot on the CBD and IPBES's definitions here. That'll form the building blocks of the framework, and we want it to be closely aligned with the CBD. The second is a data working group. So we're starting out with a kind of landscape assessment of what data is out there, what data platforms, how do we think about the quality of data for different sectors, geographies, and getting really granular about those sources of data. And the third is, again, starting with the landscape assessments of existing metrics, existing work on targets and standards that we can draw into the framework. So we're getting the foundation of how we build on existing work and how we will put it together in the framework. And then the 4th and 5th working groups that the task force are involved in now are much more cross-cutting. One is bringing this all together into this first beta version of the framework for release early next year. And the 5th is on pilot testing. And so what we're hoping very specifically is to produce an online platform. So people coming to the framework and wanting to pilot test it will come to an online platform that enables them to navigate through the content of the framework, to understand it, to go on that learning journey that Mariaz was explaining, drawing on a range of resources, but also to see clearly some guidelines for what does it mean to pilot test this framework, what are the questions that we particularly want people's help thinking through feedback and trialing this, so that we can then learn with that feedback for the next version. So it's a different kind of example, but very nuts and bolts what we're actually doing at the moment. Oh, Adil, I don't know if it's others, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. I wanted to ask you, what are your expectations for the upcoming COP15 next year and the GBF? One word each. I think it's important that you say that, because we just have 10 minutes and we have concluding remarks and we wanted to have questions, so it will be very, very short. So I give you 1 word per person, not much, sorry for that. Queen-Fan, can you perhaps begin first? 1 word. What are you waiting or hoping from the GBF next year?
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's a very, very critical for COP15 to recognize the interlinkage between the biodiversity protection with the climate change, and also the livelihood, and also of course the poverty reduction, and finally the human health. Very, very critical. Probably just add 1 word. One is, of course, we still under the pandemic. We are a year out of the pandemic, so this is One Health is approach is critical. I think the COP15. If we look at the agenda so far, the One Health is not really included. So I think that is critical. Another one is, of course, is the food system. Is they are 72% of this biodiversity loss. So I think this is a sort of the linkage, very, very critical for the success of COP15. So probably let me pause here. We have many things to share, but I guess thank you.
Thanks a lot. Gilles, what would you say? 1 word.
I would say that the Global Biodiversity Framework needs to mention the alignment of all financial fluxes to the CBD objectives. And, in Article 2.1c, for the Global Biodiversity Framework. That's key. And sorry, allow me a second word. I would say that using public finance to leverage private finance is absolutely key, and using public development banks, 10% of global investment yearly, is key as well. So I think public development banks should be recognized for what they can do to help steer private investment and develop regulation as well that work in that direction.
So Marius, private sector.
Well, I think that financial institutions, we need to set our own biodiversity goals, but the gold standard is to align our company biodiversity targets and goals with the global goals and the national targets and priorities. And so each institution might need to decide on the scope of the targets. Are we going to focus on ecosystem species, ecosystem services, and which financial activities will be covered by each goal? But we need to align our to global goals. So we are actually looking forward to this framework.
Thank you. And Emilie, the last word.
So to manage nature-related risks, there needs to be a focus on not only increasing finance for nature conservation and restoration, but also reducing financial flows into activities that harm nature. The framework needs to be ambitious, needs to be clear, and in doing so, change flows of both public and private finance.
I thank you all for really your very, very interesting experience, examples, and proof that it is feasible, it is financeable, it can be bankable, but sure, you need tools, you need metrics. As we often hear, the TNFD is there for that. Others are also there for that. You need knowledge, you need perhaps more raising, more awareness, but it's there, it's beginning, and now it's really time to act, and you show that it's possible. I won't say more because it's not useful. You said a lot. Thanks a lot to all your, to this wonderful panel. I promised to give the floor to Caroline van Lenders very quick, because she wants to offer and to propose to the negotiator mainly, or to the countries, a new helpline which is or will be developed by the Interface Dialogue Finance and Biodiversity, IDFB, and that's been developed by the Dutch government. So Caroline, we won't see you, as you know, sorry for that, but we normally should hear you. I hope your microphone is open, and if it's the case, please explain us very quick. You have 1 minute, Caroline, no more. What is this new platform?
Okay, Odile, thank you very much. Great event. Yeah, the IDFB was launched at your workshop in June. We have learned the past few weeks where we have been meeting with people, negotiating on resource mobilization, which we won't use anymore. We will say alignment. Alignment. We have had some workshops on alignment with a group of people negotiating for the CBD. And one of the things that are coming out of these sessions that we have been organizing together with the UK, by the way, is that there's a real need for capacity building and knowledge sharing. A real need to learn on how to translate all this momentum in the financial sector to alignment of all flows in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So so we have our own sessions that we organize every month with a group of negotiators, but we also would like to open up a mailbox where people that are negotiating for the CBD or the technical assistants can ask questions on what is alignment, like we discussed today, but also share all the great best practices that were mentioned, for example, by Onno, the great work that's being done by the development banks, of all the work that Jill is chairing. So we will open up a mailbox. It will be temporarily until the global deal is done. It will be temporarily. So if there is negotiators that have questions, please reach out. We will put some information in the chat where you can, people that you can mail, an email address that you can mail, or you can of course reach out to me, Caroline van Lenders, or my colleague Jan Willem van Besten. So if you all want to become bilingual, because that's our goal in this community, please ask your questions. We have a big network with the CBD Secretariat, the OECD, the UNEP, FI, Finance for Biodiversity, well, this great community that's moving this agenda. So please reach out with questions, and we hope we'll be able to give you an answer. Thank you, Odile.
Thank you, Caroline. I realized when I hear you that in fact it was a workshop on language and on learning new languages from both sides. So thanks a lot, and we can also put on the CBD website the link to this new platform and to help and the negotiator if needed to have more knowledge on that. So now it's time to the conclusion. I'm so sorry we are very short in time. That's surely my fault. But I didn't want to cut all our panelists. That was really interesting. So now Basil and Basil Van Haven, Francis Ogwal, the two co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group, the two men writing the Global Biodiversity Framework, will give us some concluding remarks. Basil and Francis, the floor is yours. I don't know who speaks first. Basil, please, and thanks in advance.
Good day to you. I'll start, and Francis will complete my remarks. Great 2 hours of conversation. I've taken a few notes and taken a few quotes that stuck in my mind. Rachel talking about the beauty of being second, and I can absolutely relate to that notion. And you, the financial sectors, I think at times are dragging us up that path to a better future. So let's keep that in mind, and that's going to be very important for you, the financial sector. You've asked us to knock on the door of the finance ministry and talk to them. And I think the negotiators are doing that, but I'm going to return the favor to you and ask you also to be knocking on those doors. So we need to push from both sides toward that group of people. We have great relationship at the multilateral level with the IMF, the World Bank, and many, but we need you to knock on the door of the finance ministry and then making the case for the negotiators to be able to create that pull. So that's one request. Another quote that stuck with me is building for the world of tomorrow. I could not agree more to that. That's a challenge. I think we gotta explain, and we gotta detail what's that world of tomorrow is, and how we can work with each other, understanding each other. I won't pretend to be a specialist in the finance and risk management work. You took me back to some of my MBA course, which are a few decades old now, unfortunately. But I know enough to know that I don't know, and I think it's going to be important to share that type of impression with the rest of the negotiators. Perhaps the number one message for today is the one from Simon about mobilizing is great and aligning is better. And I think we're gonna be it's gonna be very interesting. And I cut across to what Gilles said in his final word about the need for aligning financial flow to the GBF goals. Gilles, you should go and read the reflection document published a little bit earlier this week. You will find exactly those words suggested in the document. So hopefully there will be more than that you'll find useful in that document. Then moving to the relationship between climate and nature, I think there is good rationale for keeping separate some elements in terms of goals, but you have absolutely eloquently made the case for the need for coordination when it comes down to resources, to finance. And my sense following Glasgow is that march has already started. The question is how fast and where do we go to? And then Sylvie was talking about the complementary role of the public finance sector and the private one, definitively. So looking forward to see how we can make that happen and reflect in the various circumstances of various countries and the various configuration of those sectors. So thank you very much to all of you. This has been a very useful conversation. I wish we had more time to get into more detail. Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Basil, and thank you to the organizers for this very useful discussion. If you're picking a little bit of some sound behind my background, it is because I'm in some area that's not so free in terms of people talking behind me. But I just would like to add a few things to what Basil has said here. And I would like to say that really we should begin now to look at biodiversity loss as being a very big risk to the financial sector. And therefore that linkage of biodiversity and climate change, I think should be even much stronger, to the effect that the resources that are being mobilized for climate change, we need to see how we harmonize that to take care of biodiversity, because it might be fatiguing for parties or for governments to first put a resource envelope for climate change and you put a resource envelope for biodiversity. If it is through some bilateral arrangement and we say so much is going for climate change, can we have a ratio there very clearly put? Climate change maybe will get 50%, biodiversity gets 50%, so that you're approaching this thing holistically. Otherwise, it will always look like now we have another problem, biodiversity, now we have another problem of climate change. But these are the two critical crises that the world is facing right now. And I think we don't need to put our foot off the pedal when it comes to biodiversity. Those two are very much linked to each other. And therefore, when you look at some of the targets in the post-2020 itself, look at target 15, look at target 18, look at target 20, you find we're talking there about private sector. We're talking about private finance in there. If those targets are still not well harmonized, but I think with the time, they should be, because we are talking about contribution from all sources to bring to this resource envelope that is needed. So I think moving forward, biodiversity financing shouldn't be left behind when it comes to the time for COP. We should give it the same emphasis, we should give it the same attention, we should give it the same urgency like climate change. We need our leaders to talk about biodiversity. Why should climate change be attracting so much attention globally? Our global leaders, as you know them, they converge for climate change. And when to biodiversity, people seem to think that crisis is not what we are telling them it is. So we need to rally the political angle as well, that they are there, because their presence really, really signals something. And we've seen that in the part one of the COP that there were a number of heads of states there, but we need to have more of them as we go towards COP 15. We need to have as many of them as we can, so that they give us that political clout that biodiversity is lacking. We need that political clout. And lastly, on the alignment, yes, I would agree, we need to do that. But even where the alignment has been done, we need to see commitments being fulfilled. Because I listened to climate change discussion online and also on BBC, and I still found that after 5 years, after almost 6 years, there were concerns that the pledges had not been fulfilled. So even where pledges have been made, which is good, people should walk the talk. We should see that being put into action, because we are not going to put a full stop to climate change or to biodiversity loss because the commitments are not being fulfilled in time. So those are the things that I think I needed to add to what Basil has said. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Basil and Francis. And it's now time to close this workshop. We have it's 10:05 in Montreal. So thanks a lot to all our panelists and moderators and coaches and Elisabeth Bremer and Inge Anderson. I think we got a lot of food for thought for the coming work on the way to the COP15. Thanks a lot for all your contribution, and see you next in any other event. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.